The Oakwood Country Club in Connecticut smells exactly like what it is. Generations of inherited wealth, heavily polished mahogany, and sharp gin. It is the kind of room designed to make you feel small if you do not belong, with its towering vaulted ceilings and suffocatingly thick Persian rugs that absorb the sound of your footsteps. I was standing near the back of the private dining room, perfectly centered between two marble pillars, when the heavy velvet bag hit my chest. I caught it by instinct. My hands moved before my conscious mind registered the object. It was my older sister Chloe's bridal emergency kit, a $200 absurdly plush pink velvet tote bag packed with travel-sized hairspray, blister cushions, and double-sided tape. To my muscles, conditioned by the brutal, unforgiving weight of a 60-pound rucksack over uneven European terrain, the bag weighed absolutely nothing. But in the context of the room, it carried the weight of a tactical strike. "Sarah, since you're already just standing there," Chloe said. She didn't just speak, she projected. She weaponized the acoustics of the dining hall, ensuring her voice carried over the soft clinking of silver forks against fine china. The ambient chatter of 30 wealthy guests, junior finance vice presidents, real estate heirs, and local socialites ground to a sudden, jarring halt. I looked at my sister. Chloe was radiant in a custom white silk cocktail dress, her hair perfectly styled, her posture radiating the manic, desperate energy of a woman trying to secure her place in a higher tax bracket. "Hold on to this for the night," Chloe continued, her voice dripping with that specific, sickly sweet condescension reserved entirely for family. "Make sure I have water between photos. And keep an eye on my hemline. Let's be honest, it's not like you're doing anything important. Since you're basically just a glorified secretary in Camo, you should be great at running errands." There is a specific kind of silence that follows a public execution. It is dense, expectant, and utterly breathless. The 30 guests turned to look at me. I was wearing a simple tailored navy dress, my posture rigid, standing in the shadows of the room. I felt the collective gaze of the bridal party wash over me. A few of the bridesmaids, women who had never worked a 12-hour shift in their lives, exchanged amused, pitying glances. One of them let out a short, stifled laugh. I saw my parents seated at the head table. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair and took a slow sip of his scotch. My mother looked down at her plate. Neither of them intervened. Neither of them said a word. They were embarrassed by me, but they were more embarrassed by the friction of a public confrontation. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. There are moments when your training takes over before your emotions can catch up. Years of service had rewired something fundamental in me. Even in unfamiliar places, my body still defaulted to readiness. Stillness first, awareness second, movement last. I felt the sudden spike of adrenaline, the sharp, hot rush of blood to my ears that signals a threat. My heart rate elevated, but my breathing remained slow, measured, and entirely under my control. I executed a silent, instantaneous tactical assessment of the room. I noted the exits. I noted the staff freezing near the catering doors. I noted the smug, satisfied curve of my sister's mouth. I simply held the pink velvet bag. I shifted my weight slightly, locking my knees, and clasped my hands together over the absurdly fluffy straps, resting them comfortably at my waist. I assumed a modified parade rest. True discipline is not the absence of anger. It is the absolute, unquestioned mastery over it. I could have destroyed her narrative right then. I could have laid out the reality of my life, the sheer, staggering scope of my responsibilities, and shattered the fragile glass house she was building for her new in-laws. I could have raised my voice. I could have thrown the bag to the floor. But doing so would have meant surrendering my bearing. It would have meant playing her game on her territory. Instead, I offered her nothing. I kept my chin level, my eyes fixed forward, and my expression entirely void of emotion. I let the silence stretch. I let the cruelty of her words hang in the air, allowing the guests to sit in the awkward, heavy discomfort of what she had just done. My composure was not a sign of surrender. It was a fortress she lacked the artillery to breach. I watched the smugness in Chloe's eyes flicker, replaced by a brief, confusing flash of irritation. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to shrink, to argue, to play the role of the defensive, inferior younger sister. My total lack of response was starving her of the oxygen she needed to solidify her dominance. I looked past her. Over her shoulder at the far end of the dining room were the heavy oak double doors leading to the main foyer. I knew the layout of this evening. I knew the timeline. I knew exactly who had been delayed at the airport and who was scheduled to arrive at this exact minute. More importantly, I knew his resume, his clearance level, and the precise nature of his defense contracts. I maintained my steady, unbroken gaze, feeling the soft velvet of the emergency kit against my palms. I didn't flinch when my sister called me a glorified secretary in camo, because I knew the man walking through the double doors behind her was about to end her wedding before it even began. To understand how I arrived at this exact moment, standing at parade rest in a $200 dress while clutching a pink velvet makeup bag, you have to understand the foundational architecture of the Hayes family. I am Major Sarah Hayes. I am an 04 in the United States Army, currently serving under the 21st Theater Sustainment Command, operating out of Panzerkaserne in Kaiserslautern, Germany. But in the airtight, superficial ecosystem of my family, military rank is an abstract concept. To them, success is exclusively measured in square footage, equity, and access to exclusive spaces. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Hayes, built a localized empire developing $4 million custom colonials in Fairfield County. They deal in zip codes, zoning permits, and country club memberships. My sister Chloe monetized that exact lifestyle. She is a digital influencer whose entire existence is curated into aesthetic, sponsor-friendly squares. Her world is dictated by engagement metrics and brand deals. My family traded in prestige. I traded in pallets of 155mm artillery shells. I did not become a military officer because I lacked civilian options. That was the first assumption my parents made, and it was the first of many I stopped trying to correct. 7 years ago, I had an acceptance letter to Georgetown Law sitting on the granite island of my parents' kitchen. The path was laid out in perfect, predictable concrete. 3 years in D.C., a junior associate position at a white shoe firm, a respectable marriage, and a corner office by 35. The day I declined my seat at Georgetown and signed my commissioning paperwork for officer candidate school, my father looked at me as if I had just set fire to a winning lottery ticket. He told me I was making a catastrophic financial error. He told me the military was a place for people who couldn't cut it in the corporate sector. People who measure worth by a corporate title will never understand the terrible, quiet burden of a command. The title glorified secretary did not materialize out of thin air. It was a narrative of convenience constructed by my mother. When I first deployed to Europe as a young lieutenant, I made the mistake of trying to explain theater logistics to her over a crackling FaceTime call. I mentioned managing supply requests, tracking personnel movements, and working in a command center. Her eyes glazed over. She possessed no frame of reference for the sheer scale of military operations. In her mind, managing supplies translated to ordering printer toner and filing travel vouchers. She told her country club friends I was doing administrative work for the government. I never corrected her. It was a tactical retreat to preserve my own peace. You cannot explain the freezing wind of a C-17 tarmac to someone who complains about the draft in a 5-star hotel. The reality of my 20s was lived in a distinctly different universe than my sister's. While Chloe was weeping over a delayed shipment of custom floral centerpieces for a sponsored photo shoot, I was standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a tactical operations center at 030, coordinating the emergency rerouting of aviation fuel across 3 international borders. I oversee a $450 million logistical pipeline. When a mechanized infantry brigade needs to push 90 M1A2 Abrams tanks from a port in Bremerhaven through the Suwałki Gap and into a forward operating site in Poland, they do not move until my signature hits a Department of Defense manifest. If I miscalculate a rail gauge transition schedule, an entire armored battalion sits paralyzed on the European theater. If my supply lines fail, soldiers do not eat, vehicles do not move, and weapons do not fire. My 20s were defined by missed family holidays, cold coffee in styrofoam cups, and the crushing, absolute certainty that lives depended on my precision. I traded the comfort of Fairfield County for the austere, unforgiving reality of keeping NATO's eastern flank breathing. But distance breeds detachment. The longer I stayed in Germany, the wider the chasm between my reality and my family's reality became. To them, I was just Sarah, the anomaly, the daughter who took a modest government salary to bounce around overseas doing data entry. I was the cautionary tale they whispered about when discussing my sister's immense, glittering success. True authority does not require validation from those who are fundamentally incapable of understanding it. And so I stood in the private dining room of the Oakwood Country Club, feeling the plush velvet of the bridal kit under my hands. I watched the wealthy, insulated guests of the rehearsal dinner stare at me with a mixture of amusement and pity. They saw exactly what Chloe wanted them to see, a failure. An errand girl in a modest navy dress. They did not know that the meticulous, disciplined silence I was exhibiting was not submission. It was targeting. I knew exactly who was paying for the floral centerpieces on the tables. I knew exactly whose signature underwrote the lavish lifestyle Julian's family enjoyed. And I knew that the man whose name was on those checks was entirely dependent on mine. The rehearsal dinner transitioned seamlessly from an uncomfortable cocktail hour into a meticulously choreographed seating arrangement. I had retreated to a shadowy alcove near the waitstaff entrance, the pink velvet bag still firmly in my grip, observing the mechanics of the room. At $250 per plate, the Oakwood Country Club did not merely serve meals, it executed culinary deployments. Waiters in starched white jackets moved in strict formations, dropping plates of seared filet mignon and truffle risotto with synchronized precision. Julian the groom was seated at the center of the head table. He was a 28-year-old junior vice president of wealth management who wore a bespoke Italian suit and carried the unearned, frictionless confidence of a man whose father had paved every road he ever walked. Men who inherit their power are fundamentally terrified of women who command their own. Halfway through the main course, Julian stood and tapped his silver butter knife against his crystal water goblet. The high, sharp ringing cut through the ambient jazz. The room fell silent. He began his toast, a sprawling, self-congratulatory speech about his own success, his pristine new bride, and the wealthy ecosystem they were about to build together. Then his eyes drifted to the back of the room. He spotted me standing near the catering doors, and of course, we have to thank Chloe's sister, Sarah. Still standing guard back there, Julian said, offering a patronizing, pitying smile. A low ripple of laughter moved through the dining room. I did not shift my stance. I kept my eyes locked on his. Julian leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Chloe tells me you're basically a secretary in Camo over there in Germany. Honestly, it's noble. Really, it is. Living on that modest government salary, pushing paper, doing the data entry so the real soldiers can do their jobs. We're just glad you could get the administrative leave to come be our errand girl today. Somebody has to hold the makeup. Another wave of laughter, louder this time. The bridesmaids giggled behind their linen napkins. The hardest part of military discipline is keeping your mouth shut under enemy fire. It's keeping it shut when your own blood tries to publicly execute your character. I looked at my parents. My mother, Eleanor, was vigorously cutting a piece of asparagus, aggressively avoiding my gaze. My father, Richard, took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, staring straight ahead. In their world, Julian was a prized asset. He was connected to massive capital. I was a liability. They were willing to let me be publicly degraded if it meant securing their daughter's position in a higher tax bracket. The betrayal wasn't just in the words. It was in the deafening, complicit silence of the people who raised me. If you've ever had to bite your tongue while someone who doesn't know a fraction of your worth tried to make you feel small, hit the like button. Let's see how many of us know the power of staying silent. I calculated the sheer, suffocating irony of the moment. Julian was a junior VP who spent his days cold calling clients to manage portfolios worth, at most, a few $1,000,000. He was currently panicking over securing a $15,000 check from his father to cover a luxury honeymoon in Bora Bora. He had absolutely no idea that less than 72 hours ago, sitting in a classified SIF in Kaiserslautern, I had personally authorized a logistical maneuver involving 12 Boeing C-17 Globemasters and 300 heavily armored vehicles. I manage a $450 million supply chain. I dictate the operational readiness of American forces across an entire continent. When a four-star general needs to understand the theater-wide capability of our armored divisions, my briefing is the only document on his desk. Julian thought I fetched coffee. I fetched battalions. But I allowed the delusion to breathe. I allowed it to take root in the room. I watched Chloe lean her head on Julian's shoulder, beaming with triumph. She had successfully established the hierarchy. She was the golden child. I was the disposable help. A bridesmaid at the table closest to me turned around in her chair. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain dress and the absurd pink bag. "Does the army teach you fast typing at least?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Or do they just make you run laps before you file the paperwork?" I looked at her. I noted her dilated pupils from the gin, the slight tremor in her hands, the absolute fragility of her worldview. "They teach us how to assess threats," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the jazz music, "and how to ignore the irrelevant ones." She blinked, confused by the clinical detachment in my voice, and quickly turned back around. You do not waste heavy artillery on a target that is already actively self-destructing. I resumed my silence. The dinner marched on. I was a ghost in the room, a piece of living furniture, designated for their amusement, but my eyes kept drifting to the empty chair to Julian's right, the head of the table. The seat reserved for the patriarch of the Vance family, a man whose arrival had been delayed by a board meeting in D.C. Julian's entire identity was wrapped up in that empty chair. And in exactly 14 minutes, the man meant to fill it was going to walk through those heavy oak doors, look at the glorified secretary, and recognize the single most important asset to his company's survival. Silence is a weapon, and like any weapon, its effectiveness depends entirely on timing. For the next 40 minutes, I remained at my post near the catering doors. My calves burned slightly from the rigid stance, a familiar dull ache that brought me back to the parade grounds of Fort Benning. The pink velvet emergency kit was still clutched firmly in my hands. I watched the staff clear the dinner plates. I watched the wine glasses empty and refill. I watched my sister hold court at the center of the room, oblivious to the fact that she was dancing on a trapdoor. At 8:15 p.m., the hired photographer arrived, a nervous-looking man with a heavy DSLR camera and a glaringly bright ring light. He began orchestrating the bridal party for candid table shots. My mother, Eleanor, stood up from the head table and made a beeline toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor surrounding the Persian rugs. She looked flustered, her eyes scanning my outfit with thinly veiled panic. "Sarah, darling," she whispered, her voice tight with forced civility. She pulled me slightly further into the shadows of the alcove. "The photographer is doing the official seating portraits now. Do you, by chance, have something else to slip into? Something a little less drab?" I looked down at my dress. It was a tailored midnight blue wool crepe sheath. It was immaculate. "I didn't bring a change of clothes, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level. She sighed, a sharp exhalation of disappointment that I had heard 1,000 times throughout my childhood. "Right. Well, Chloe has a very specific aesthetic for the album. We need the tone to be cohesive. Do you mind just stepping out into the hall while he shoots this side of the room? You understand." She was asking me to leave the room so my presence wouldn't infect the visual perfection of her other daughter's life. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her that I had flown 14 hours across the Atlantic on 48 hours of leave just to stand in this room. I simply offered a crisp, singular nod. "Understood. I will stay out of the frame." A tactical retreat is not a surrender. It is a calculated repositioning to secure higher ground. My mother offered a tight, relieved smile and hurried back to the flashing cameras. I stepped further back into the alcove, blending seamlessly into the dark mahogany paneled walls. I watched Julian wrap his arm around Chloe, laughing loudly for the lens, but Julian's eyes kept darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors at the front of the dining hall. He was sweating. Beneath the bespoke Italian wool, the groom was terrified. Julian's entire future hinged on the arrival of his father, Arthur Vance. Julian was playing the role of a successful financier, but the reality was that he desperately needed his father's $15,000 check to cover the luxury Bora Bora honeymoon Chloe had already posted about on her social media. He needed his father's approval to maintain the illusion of his independence. What Julian did not know, what no one in that room knew, was the true nature of Arthur Vance's business. Arthur Vance was not just a wealthy patriarch. He was Major General Arthur Vance, United States Army, retired. He had commanded the Army Materiel Command before transitioning to the private sector. He was currently the CEO of Vanguard Logistics Solutions, a massive defense contracting firm based out of Virginia. Vanguard Logistics held a highly lucrative, highly precarious Department of Defense contract for heavy equipment transport across the European theater. They moved the armored vehicles that my command utilized. 6 weeks ago, Vanguard's European subsidiary had been on the verge of financial collapse due to a catastrophic backlog at the port of Bremerhaven. Millions of dollars in capital were tied up in frozen assets. They were hemorrhaging money. Their survival depended on a single massive reimbursement voucher for an emergency railroad operation in Stuttgart. I was the exact, singular commanding officer who untangled the international customs dispute, authorized the operation, and personally signed the Department of Defense voucher that saved his company from missing payroll. Power is not defined by who speaks the loudest in the room. Power is defined by whose signature controls the room's oxygen. General Vance and I had never met in a civilian setting. But we had spent hours on secure video teleconferences. He knew my face, he knew my voice, he knew exactly what the silver oak leaf on my chest represented. At 8:22 p.m., the heavy brass handles of the dining room doors finally turned. The air pressure in the room seemed to shift. The ambient chatter died away instantly. The jazz quartet instinctively lowered their volume. Even the photographer lowered his camera. Major General Arthur Vance walked into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit. But you could put the man in civilian clothes for a decade, and he would still walk like he owned the airspace. His posture was perfectly rigid. His eyes scanned the room with the cold, sweeping precision of a theater commander assessing a battlefield. Julian instantly puffed out his chest, his face breaking into a desperate, relieved smile. He stood up from the head table, straightening his tie, preparing to welcome the source of his funding. Chloe mirrored his movements, smoothing down her white silk dress, ready to play the perfect submissive daughter-in-law. I remained in the shadows. I locked my knees. I took a slow, silent breath through my nose. The trap was fully set. The general was on the floor. Have you figured out what happens next? Drop a comment below right now and tell me if you would have broken your silence by now, or if you'd wait for the drop. Make sure you're subscribed, because the reality check my sister is about to get is permanent. General Vance did not simply walk into the room, he advanced. Every step he took across the dining hall was measured, deliberate, and carried the heavy, unmistakable cadence of a man who was entirely accustomed to people moving out of his way. Julian stepped forward eagerly, his arm outstretched, his face plastered with the desperate, ingratiating smile of a subordinate. Chloe flanked him, perfectly poised, ready to execute her rehearsed greeting. "Dad," Julian said, his voice a pitch too high, projecting for the benefit of the surrounding tables. "We were starting to think the flight from D.C. kept you grounded. Chloe and I are so glad you made it." General Vance did not take his son's hand. He did not look at his son's bride. His sharp, slate-gray eyes were sweeping the perimeter of the room, executing a habit that decades of military service had permanently burned into his neurocircuitry. He bypassed the head table entirely. He walked straight past Julian's outstretched hand, leaving his son standing awkwardly in the center of the Persian rug. The ambient chatter in the room instantly evaporated. The silence that fell over the Oakwood Country Club was absolute. Arrogance builds a glass house, but it takes a two-star general to drop the stone. I remained in the shadows of the alcove, my back straight, my hands still clasped around the absurd pink velvet straps of the bridal emergency kit. I did not move, I waited. General Vance's eyes locked onto mine. He stopped dead in his tracks, roughly 10 feet away from me. I saw the immediate flash of recognition register on his face. I saw the brief, microscopic furrow of his brow as he processed my civilian clothing, and then the stark, jarring contrast of the ridiculous fluffy bag I was holding. He didn't hesitate. The general squared his shoulders, brought his feet together with a sharp, audible click of his leather dress shoes, and snapped to the rigid position of attention right there in the middle of the dining hall. "Major Hayes," his voice boomed, rich and commanding, echoing off the mahogany walls. "It is a profound honor to finally meet you in person." The room did not just freeze, it stopped breathing. I offered a crisp, single nod of acknowledgement. "Good evening, General. The honor is mine." Julian scrambled, turning around, his face pale and contorted with profound confusion. "Dad?" he stammered, his eyes darting between his imposing father and the woman his bride had just called a glorified errand girl. "Dad, what are you doing? That's Sarah, Chloe's sister. She just does administrative work overseas." General Vance slowly turned his head to look at his son. The look in his eyes was not familial. It was surgical. It was the look of a commander assessing a catastrophic failure in his own ranks. "Administrative work," Vance repeated. The words sounded like gravel grinding together. He turned his body slightly, addressing not just Julian, but the entire painfully silent room. "A lie can travel halfway around the world, but the truth will permanently level the ground it stands on. 30 days ago," the general began, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal calm of an impending strike, "my European subsidiary was facing a catastrophic logistical failure at the port of Bremerhaven. We had $80 million in transport assets completely paralyzed. We were 48 hours away from missing payroll for 3,000 civilian contractors." He paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. I saw Julian swallow hard. "The only reason Vanguard Logistics is solvent today," Vance continued, pointing a single, steady finger directly at me, "is because this woman, Major Sarah Hayes of the 21st Theater Sustainment Command, personally untangled an international customs dispute, authorized a theater-wide emergency maneuver, and signed a multi-million-dollar Department of Defense reimbursement voucher. She is the architect of the European supply lines that keep my company alive. The silence in the room was so thick it felt physical. The wealthy in-laws, the smug bridesmaids, the junior executives, they were all staring at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. General Vance turned his attention back to me and then slowly lowered his gaze to the pink velvet bag resting against my navy dress. "Major," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "why is a senior field-grade officer holding a makeup bag?" My mother let out a small, terrified gasp from the head table. Chloe's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I looked at my sister, I looked at Julian, then I looked back at the general. "My sister requested that I manage her supplies for the evening, sir," I replied smoothly, my tone utterly devoid of sarcasm. "I was informed I am uniquely qualified for the task." The general's jaw tightened. He turned to Chloe. She physically shrank under his gaze, stepping backward until the back of her legs hit a dining chair. "You called her secretary," Vance said, the disgust in his voice completely unmasked. "I heard you from the foyer. You humiliated a commanding officer of the United States Army in front of your peers to stroke your own ego, mister." "Vance, I didn't know," Chloe stammered, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. "She never talks about it," I thought. "You thought you were superior," Vance interrupted, cutting her off with brutal efficiency. "You cannot demand respect in a room where you have just demonstrated a fundamental lack of character." He turned to his son. Julian was shaking his head slightly, a desperate, pleading look on his face. "Julian," his father said coldly, "a woman who is comfortable degrading a military officer for public amusement is not a woman who understands duty, and she is certainly not a woman who will respect you." The general reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp white envelope. The room watched in agonizing slow motion. It was the $15,000 check for the Bora Bora honeymoon. The financial lifeline Julian had been begging for all quarter. Vance didn't yell. He didn't tear it up dramatically. He simply slid it back into his pocket. "The honeymoon funding is revoked," Vance stated, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "You are a grown man. If you wish to finance a luxury vacation for a woman who treats my colleagues like the hired help, you will do it on your own dime." Julian's mouth opened, but the oxygen had completely left his lungs. My parents sat completely paralyzed at the head table. The wealthy guests who had been laughing at me 15 minutes ago were now staring at the floor, deeply embarrassed by their own complicity. General Vance turned back to me. He offered a short, respectful bow of his head. "Major Hayes," he said quietly, "if you ever decide to leave the uniform, there is a corner office at Vanguard with your name on it. Have a good evening." He turned on his heel and walked out through the heavy oak doors, leaving the $15,000 illusion of my sister's perfect life shattered on the floor behind him. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I simply looked down, opened the pink velvet bag, and carefully placed a travel-size hairspray inside. I did not stay for dessert. I walked over to the head table, placed the heavy pink velvet bag gently next to my sister's untouched plate, and quietly excused myself from the room. I didn't wait for apologies that would only be born out of financial panic rather than genuine remorse. I didn't look at my parents, who were still frozen in the collateral damage of their own complicity. I simply walked out into the cool Connecticut evening, got into my rental car, and drove away. True authority doesn't need to shout to be heard, it only needs to exist. The next morning, the sun had not yet breached the tree line. It was 0400. The quiet, mechanical hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the small kitchen of my temporary quarters. My encrypted laptop was already open on the counter, illuminating the dark room with the sterile blue light of a secure briefing interface. At 0430, I was scheduled to synchronize a movement of mechanized infantry across the German border. The civilian world was still asleep, but my theater was already awake. I sat at the small table, feeling the familiar heavy silence of the early hours. There was no sense of triumphant joy in my chest over what had happened the night before. Destroying the fragile ego of a sibling is not a victory. It is simply the tragic, unavoidable consequence of reality colliding with delusion. My phone had been vibrating silently on the counter since midnight. There were 6 missed calls from my mother. There was a frantic, rambling text message from Chloe trying to salvage the narrative, begging me to call General Vance and smooth things over. I deleted the thread without responding. They were casualties of their own arrogance, and I had a supply chain to run. Revenge is an emotion for amateurs. Professionals are satisfied with clarity. I looked down at the counter. Resting beneath my heavy ceramic mug was a crisp linen napkin, a stark contrast to the utilitarian surfaces of temporary housing. I noticed a subtle, imperfect crease near the hem. Years of service had rewired something fundamental in me. Precision is not just a habit, it is a baseline for survival. I reached out, my fingers tracing the edge of the fabric, and carefully smoothed out the crease, flattening it against the table with deliberate, practiced muscle memory. I picked up the mug. The dark, bitter taste of black coffee hit my tongue, grounding me, reminding me exactly who I was and where I belonged. I took a slow, silent sip, turned my eyes back to the glowing screen, and went to work. The content on this channel consists of fictional stories created for storytelling and entertainment. These narratives are not intended to represent real individuals, organizations, or events. All visual elements are for illustrative purposes only. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been dismissed by the people who should have believed in you most, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. There are more stories ahead. Subscribe and stay with us.